Welcome to this talk based on historic graffiti, the hidden story of the hopes, fears and desires of a nation. My name is James Wright. I'm a heritage consultant and a buildings archaeologist, and I run a company called Triskelly Heritage, which is based in Nottingham in England. Normally I would be giving this talk in a live setting, such as this talk here at Leicester Guildhall, given in the summer of 2019, as I recall. This is obviously a slightly more unusual setting for me to be giving a lecture, which obviously is broadcast online and is a direct result of the coronavirus lockdown. However, we shall persevere, and I shall hopefully be able to navigate through this without too much trouble, and with some hope that you'll be entertained and informed at the end of it. I am a buildings archaeologist by trade. This means that unlike the majority of my colleagues in the profession who are excavating in cold, dirty, muddy, wet, awful holes in the ground, I am in the relative comfort and safety of historic standing buildings, most of which will have a roof, some of which will have a source of heating, and if I'm really very lucky, they might even have a bar. Although no drinking on site, health and safety precaution there. And it must be said that the study of historic graffiti is very much a niche subject within the subject of historic standing buildings. It has only really become archaeologically mainstream to record historic graffiti probably in the last 5 to 10 years. It's becoming increasingly more usual for our clients to ask us to actually record the inscriptions and scribes of people from the past on the walls of their buildings. But it is still quite an emerging subject. So what we're going to do with this talk then is I'm going to make a few introductory remarks, and I'm going to give you an idea of the types of graffiti that could be expected to be found in our historic buildings. Roughly 20–30% of those inscriptions, certainly in medieval and early modern buildings, are going to be ritual protection marks, signs marked up on the walls to ward away evil. And we'll look at a very defined section on that before giving a case study of ritual protection at the Queen's House from the Tower of London, before making some concluding remarks. So for many of us, our experience of graffiti is the modern sort, spray painted on the walls of maybe industrial wasteland or railway sidings or inner city suburbs, and in the most part people find it very annoying. It's an eyesore, it's problematic, it's possibly redolent of crime and ganglands and drugs, etc., etc. There are of course some very fine street artists out there, and we really must give them credit. It must be said that graffiti itself does have some social value in society, and it must be said that there are messages that we can understand about graffiti and its place in society and what it is saying about that society. And if that's true of modern graffiti, then it's definitely true of medieval and early modern graffiti. We can actually cast back and we can start to understand something of the psychologies and emotions of people from the past. Now, if you're a medieval peasant, it is unlikely that you are going to enter the historical record. And as a result, if you have actually left graffiti, maybe on the walls of your parish church, this may be the only opportunity for you to enter that historical record. And as such, the study of graffiti is hugely, hugely important, because it does give us a direct insight to the lives of people who will otherwise not appear. So as a result, graffiti can be said to be an incredibly important social document, which is every bit as significant as anything that you could find in your local record office in the archives. So my life essentially looks like this. When recording graffiti, here I am, I'm the chap crouched down on the right hand side there at Bodiam Castle, photograph taken by my friend and colleague Natalie Cohen from the National Trust, who also has the honour of running the Kent Medieval Graffiti Survey. And I'm there with Matthew Champion, who's very much Mr. Graffiti. He literally wrote the book on the subject. And what we are doing is casting raking torchlight at an angle over the walls in a dimly lit environment to try and pick up the very, very lightly inscribed graffiti on the walls of Bodiam Castle. It's essentially casting light to create shadow. And when we see those shadows, we can start to pick out the very, very lightly inscribed graffiti that is probably not visible with the naked eye. We will then photograph that using a camera fixed to a tripod. We'll fill in some paperwork, and then we can go away and start to statistically model and analyse our findings back in the office. And I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, how does he know that this is actually genuinely historic graffiti that he's recording? It must be said that the vast majority of graffiti that we're seeing is in fact non-literate and non-numerate. It's pictorials, pictograms to all intents and purposes. And so when we see that later graffiti that's left there, it's the names, the dates and the initials, we can often see that it's over the top of much earlier graffiti. Here's a really good example picked out from the English Medieval Graffiti Facebook group, and we can see a selection of names and dates over the top of a much more lightly inscribed circular design with petals within, which is often called a hex foil or a daisy wheel, a compass drawn design. And if we look at the dates carved over the top of that graffito, we can see that we've got 1862 at the top, we've got 1751, and right down in the bottom right hand corner we've got 1721 as well. So we can be fairly certain that that circular design predates 1721, which is going to push it back into at least the early modern period, if not the medieval. And here we can see an example of what is almost certainly a medieval graffito. It comes from St Mary's at Haresborough in Norfolk. It is another one of those compass drawn circles, and if we look really very closely, and I've overdrawn this for you here, we can see the lime wash of the Reformation, which would have occurred during the mid-16th century, where the church reformers are painting over the former illustrations in the churches in a pure and plain white, and any graffiti which has been cut into those earlier medieval paintings and wall coverings is going to therefore have cut into the stonework below. And when the reformers come along and they lime wash the building, that lime wash falls into the cracks quite literally, and we can see it here preserved. Obviously much later on the Victorians have come along and removed all paintwork. The graffiti survives, and we just get a trace of that lime wash. So we can say with some degree of confidence here that this is a medieval graffito. This part of the church dates to about the 15th century, so this would have been put on in a narrow window of somewhere between the earlier 15th century and the mid to late 16th century. So we can be fairly certain of this being medieval. So we've looked at, or we are going to look at, a huge number of inscriptions which come from an ecclesiastical context. Churches, monasteries, cathedrals, etc. The reason for this is simply that it's much easier for graffiti researchers to get into churches and cathedrals simply because they are open to the public in a way that private houses are not. Almost every single building which is constructed before probably the middle of the 18th century is going to have some of this type of graffiti within it, of these older pictograms, these non-literate, non-numerate examples. And here we can see something which is actually slightly more redolent of formal church art, but still we would record that as we're working in these ecclesiastical buildings. And this is a consecration cross. It's the undescribing of a consecration cross, which has been initially scribed and then painted over. Of course, we've lost the paintwork. And the purpose of this was actually so that the bishop could touch it during the consecration of the building, and he would touch it with holy oil to actually bring the building into practical use by the church. So we're seeing something which is part of formal church art. And this next slide as well has something of that too. This is probably the underscribing for some very, very beautiful wall paintings. Here we see the I and the H of the Christogram, the first three letters of Christ's name in Greek. We're missing the S. It's probably been chiselled away, almost certainly by Victorian reformers, during Victorian Restoration, more likely. But we can see that, again, this is in a very late medieval style. It's probably going to have been painted over, and it's something that would have been quite a common motif, a common symbol within church architecture. On the left-hand side there, you can see an example from a scabbard from a tomb effigy, but these Christograms are found in all parts of the Roman Catholic medieval church. So we're seeing underscribing for formal artwork, but something which is much, much more informal are these scratch dials, sometimes called mass dials, and they are essentially informal sundials, primarily found on the south side of churches, not always, curiously. So not all of these are going to be functional, but that's an entirely different discussion which could be had. What we're probably seeing here is the church bell ringers who are scribing these onto the walls so that they can get a sense of when it is exactly time to call the faithful to prayer. They are one of the most common types of graffiti that we find in parish churches. They are some of the easiest to find. Most of these, as I say, are going to be on the south side of the church for obvious reasons, to catch the sunlight. Once the faithful have been brought to prayer, it must be remembered that in those bigger churches, in the monastic churches, in the cathedrals, the Mass is going to be sung. And as a result, there's a huge cacophonous, beautiful soundtrack that we should associate with these buildings. And it should come as no surprise to us, therefore, that we're actually finding musical notation on the walls of the churches. Here you can see an example from St Albans in Hertfordshire on the south aisle of the nave. We can see a 5-bar stave, and we can also see some hollow note mensual notation. This is almost certainly dating to the middle years of the 15th century. A few years ago, I got a folk musician friend of mine to actually play and record this, and what came out was something which was akin to a variant of the song Girls and Boys Come Out to Play. So we can already see how graffiti studies can actually be helpful to other branches of historical research as well. Music historians, for example, may find the dating of that particular variant of the folk song very, very useful. Obviously, that's a secular tune rather than a religious one. So if we are recording so much in these parish churches, perhaps it should come as no shock whatsoever to us to find that there are crosses all over these buildings. Crosses, of course, to do with the crucifix, to do with Easter, etc., etc., etc. However, what we are finding by statistically modelling these things is that the vast majority of these crosses carved into the walls of our churches are actually in and around the porches rather than in the main body of the church itself. And if you take the concept of the porch and look at it in a little bit more detail, it soon comes to the attention that the porch is a liminal space. It's an access route between the temporal outside world and the sacred inner world. And it's used in quite an unusual way to our mind in the 21st century. So quite a few of the major rites of passage in the Catholic Church occur either just outside the porch or within it itself. So elements of the baptismal service and also the wedding service would take place there as well. So they are much more important spaces than they are given credit for in the modern age. And we know from documentary accounts that one of the things that porches are used for is actually secular business meetings take place there. I'll meet you at the church porch. We can agree how many sheep you'll shear for me, and then you will put your mark onto the building. And that's possibly what we are seeing here, and why we have just so many crosses. It's literally a business contract. It's akin to swearing on the Bible, but you're using the Holy Church to make your mark as part of that contract. And that's so we're moving now into a much more secular world. Here, for example, we see an observation of the world around the monks of St Albans Abbey, as it was then in the medieval period, and we can see a rather humorous graffito of a cat giving itself an intimate wash. Now, for those of you who are not owned by cats, I can give you a modern day example of exactly what is going on here. There is my cat Spike 3 years ago giving himself such a wash in my garden. And in fact, there is Panga, the Wells Cathedral cat, in exactly the same pose as the St Albans Cathedral cat in maybe the 13th, 14th, 15th century or whenever it was carved. And so we're seeing observations of that world around. It's not just graffiti which is related to the activities of the church, the formal activities. We are also seeing something of the medieval world, and that earthy humour that's there in so many of the poets, for example Geoffrey Chaucer. Cats are everywhere today. Of course, they rule the internet. And in the medieval period, they were kept as ratters and mousers as well. In fact, there's a very, very famous example here from Exeter Cathedral of a medieval cat flap to enable the cat to get into the north transept to prevent rats and mice from eating the cords which were connected to a medieval clock there. So they were a characteristic sight in the medieval world, which is represented in the graffiti. And as the cat has its evil nemesis, the rats and the mice, so they have been illustrated potentially there in the bottom right hand corner with the Southernminster rat. And it's these observations of the world around us which also lead us to seeing things like weaponry represented on the walls. So here at St Thomas Becket in Lewes, Sussex, we have an axe, and at St Botolph's in Trunch, a bow and arrow. And although these could be representative of perhaps soldiers or archers, they are probably slightly more likely to represent everyday activities. And they are not just everyday activities, but they are representing what the person who carved these did in life. So they're thinking of themselves according to what they offer society as a whole. You can get a glimpse of this from some of the tomb slabs at St Nicholas in Newcastle upon Tyne. There on the left hand side we see a cross fleury on a tomb slab, but just to the left hand side you may be able to pick out a pair of sheep shears. So we might be seeing a farmer here who's been buried beneath this, and the shears represent what he did in life. And on the right hand side, well, yes, we are seeing swords, so this may well be a warrior's grave. And if we consider again those pieces of weaponry on the right hand side, is that potentially the woodsman's axe and the forester's bow? Is this what they did in life? And although this could be seen as the medieval equivalent of Kev was here, scratched onto the walls, equally these may represent prayers in stone, and the person has left something behind of themselves. We'll never fully understand the motivations, and we can never get too dogmatic when appreciating and trying to understand graffiti. Everything has to be taken in and of its own context. There is no one-stop shop for interpreting all graffiti. Also, in terms of personal recognition of individuals, we must also consider the fact that there are large numbers of armorials carved onto the walls. We see a very, very complex example of one from St Wilfrid's Kelham. And of course, the genealogists amongst us are probably saying, oh, well, this is fantastic. We'll be able to track down the family. It'll be amazing. We'll have no problem. One of the problems, of course, with armorials is that without the colour, you're absolutely not going to get which family this pertains with. So you could send this down to the College of Arms and they almost certainly would not be able to help you. So unfortunately, a lot of these armorials are sadly indecipherable. It's also worth remembering that some of them could well be aspirational rather than realistic representations. However, the example in the bottom right there from Tattershall Castle is almost certainly a livery badge, and it was almost certainly carved during the August of 1453 by one of the retainers of the Earl of Warwick. The Earls of Warwick, of course, famously have the ragged staff as their badge. And what we may be seeing here is, in fact, one of the retainers of the Earl of Warwick there at Tattershall in 1453 when his younger brother was getting married to the niece of Ralph Lord Cromwell. And we can imagine that one of the retainers has actually carved this into the walls during the wedding ceremony. But we can get even more personal, particularly as we move into the early modern period. And we start to see examples of figural graffiti. So one of my favourite pieces of graffiti of all is the face looking straight out of the walls, which is probably only an inch or so high at Holy Trinity, Tattershall. And we can see a face with shoulder-length hair and one of these characteristic late medieval caps, very similar to the one worn in around 1500, 1505 by Henry VII in that quite famous portrait from the National Portrait Gallery. And equally, we can see that kind of aspirational social dressing with the lady from Home Pierpont Hall in Nottinghamshire on the right-hand side. She's wearing one of these great farthingale dresses popular in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. She's also got a head tire on, and she's looking not unlike that famous portrait of Elizabeth I from about 1592. So we can start to get a glimpse of what people think of themselves. But getting even closer to the humanity behind this graffiti, these are tremendously beautiful and enigmatic hand outlines, and we see these in lots and lots of buildings. We can imagine somebody here who has come to the wall at St Peter's, Sibthorpe, in the church porch, and they've carved around their left hand. This may well be a 19th century graffito because we can actually see the date 1812 within it, or possibly the I or the JH 1812 was added to an older graffito. But necessarily this cannot be any older than the 17th century, which was when that church porch was created. It's not a reused piece of masonry. But what I particularly like about hand outlines is the fact that they take us right back to some of the very, very earliest art that we have in Western Europe. These hand outlines which date from the Ice Age in the Pyrenean caves. And we can really get a sense of connection between the two time periods. As literacy increases during the later medieval and certainly after the Reformation and definitely into the 17th century, we start to see names and dates appearing. Don't really get them before maybe the mid 16th century, but some of these we can start to say some quite concrete things about. So again, from Holy Trinity at Tattershall in Lincolnshire, we can see John Fairbank here, who has carved his name in 1568. We can say something slightly more about John in that he's also carved his merchant's mark next to it. So we can say that he's probably a fairly wealthy man, a man of commerce and industry. His merchant's mark is carved there beneath the letter B of his name, and it has his initials JF built into it. A merchant's mark is very much like a corporate logo during this period. We've not been able to find out anything more in detail about John, unfortunately, from the documentary accounts, but we can say that John has form for graffiti because there he is on the bottom slide a year before, in 1567, in the same bit of the church, also representing himself with his corporate logo. These again may represent prayers in stone. They may not simply be recollections of somebody who's actually been to the church as a visitor and leaving something behind. They may be wanting something back as well. So if they carve their name whilst making the prayer, that it makes it a solid piece of a prayerful, mindful activity. And it may be merchants who are leaving behind these rather beautiful ship graffiti as well. Of course, it may not be just the merchants, it may be sailors, it may be loved ones hoping that their travelling folk come home. It may be people leaving a prayer in stone on these ecclesiastical buildings, hoping for good fortune in commerce, good fortune on the waves. They are tremendously beautiful, they're incredibly detailed. The amount of time spent on these gives us an idea that this was a perfectly regular activity. This wasn't something that was clandestine or transgressive. It was absolutely fine to put graffiti onto the walls of churches. Many of these are cut through wall paintings. There is absolutely no evidence, certainly not until the later 17th century, of court cases against people for inscribing on the walls of churches. So again, the time spent in these prayers in stone it really does help to give us an idea of how our opinion of graffiti has changed over time as well. That's not to say that there isn't, in a sense, some rather unusual graffiti going on in the catalogue that we've recorded over the years. This is a piece of research done by Mr. Graffiti himself, Matthew Champion. Very famous graffito, which has made it onto our television screens on several occasions. And it's actually a curse. It's a surname which is written both back to front and upside down. So if I actually interpret it for you here, you can see that it's the name Caneford. And it's on the walls of Norwich Cathedral. And Matthew's interpretation of this is that it's actually in one of the holiest areas of the old monastic church at Norwich, which is right in the choir, which is probably it's probably an area which is only accessible to the monks themselves. So quite what the Caneford family had done to to irritate one of the monks of Norwich in the late medieval period, we will never know. However, they have been cursed. And so there is this darker aspect to graffiti. We're seeing curses on the walls. It's not just representations of life. And of course, as we have life, we also have death. And here's a couple of buildings in Lincolnshire which have illustrations of gallows on them. And we must remember that this was a common sight in our period, that there was capital justice, and that the sight of bodies hanging from a gallows would be there in most, if not most parishes, then certainly most hundreds during this period. Certainly in Nottingham, I know that our gallows was at the top of Mansfield Road, where there's now a cemetery. And this would be something which would be there. It would be part of visual justice. And so we're seeing representations. It's also worth bearing in mind that some of these buildings that we are finding illustrations of gallows in may also have been centres of justice in and of themselves as well. So we're starting to approach the end of life. And one of the more common types of graffiti within buildings are these memorials. Now, they're not always to the dead, but in some instances we do get a feeling that they possibly are. Here we see a building with a cross on it and a name inscribed in a 16th, 17th, maybe early 18th century hand. And this is from St Mary Magdalene at Newark. And we can imagine a situation where John Glover's family cannot afford a ledger stone or a tombstone, and certainly not a tomb effigy, and so that they have left behind this rather touching memorial on the choir, the retro choir screen at Newark. In a sense, this is John Glover's memorial. So we've approached a slightly darker end of graffiti. And I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that 20 to 30%, maybe even slightly more, of graffiti that we're recording in these buildings actually has an aspect which is there to do with the ritual protection of the building and its occupants from the threat of evil, from demonic activity, from the threat of witches. This might seem a little kooky to us in the 21st century, but if you go back into the 16th and 17th centuries in particular, the social changes that are occurring are so enormous. There is a tremendous sense of upheaval. And it is a time where people are thinking in a very, very different way about the world. Everything is shaped by religion. And also these socio-economic and political changes, as well as changes in religion, are causing a kind of a neuroses, a societal-wide neuroses, where instead of approaching the root causes of these many changes to society, what we are seeing is, in a sense, scapegoating. They're looking for liminal, marginalized groups to blame for their problems. And instead of it being the problems of government or the problems of the economy, what they're doing is they're blaming liminal, marginalized people, which tend to be, in this period, teenage girls and elderly spinsters who are accused of hexing people so that they have bad luck. And they are accused of being in league with Satan. It's a very, very disturbing trend in society, but we do see a huge increase in witchcraft accusations during this period. And lots of social historians have looked at this, and they've shown that it's essentially anxieties and tensions coming out in society, and those are created by religious changes, change from Catholicism to Protestantism, who's looking out for your immortal soul. It's social changes, the doubling of the population in just 1 century. Agricultural change, such as the enclosures of previously common lands, the open fields, which are now being enclosed by landowners, the changeover from arable to pastoral economies, which leads to people being thrown off the land. They can no longer feed themselves, and of course this leads to a lack of food. The price of food goes up, but also the drop in wages occurs at the same time, and people start seeing these problems in societies and blaming the marginalised for them. And of course, this is all egged on by the law, with witchcraft being enshrined in law and made illegal in these 3 acts of Parliament. And within the witchcraft accusations, we start to see a class tension coming out, where slightly richer people are accusing, again, these liminalized people of witchcraft. And so it might be something like the farmer accusing the milkmaid of hexing the cow, which is why it went barren. A tremendously disturbing time in history, but also one which we have to say is a little bit familiar in the 21st century. If you take the word witchcraft out of there and insert maybe benefit scrounger, maybe Muslim, maybe immigrant, you can see that we're straight into the red top newspapers. We're repeating this issue. These socio-economic, political, religious issues are being repeated in fact, the 21st century in a manner not too dissimilar to the 16th and 17th century witch crazes. So we've got this threat of evil. Satan's real, he's stalking the land, and he's coming to get you. And it's no great surprise that people want to protect themselves from this. And what they seem to do is to turn back to quite ancient traditions. And within ancient Judaism, there is this culture, there is this tradition that King Solomon of the Bible was given a seal ring, which had the power to repel demons. And we're not told in the Talmud exactly what the cipher on this ring was. But when the tradition passes down the great Abrahamic faiths, it's reinterpreted initially by the Muslims as a 6-pointed star. And by the time it comes to Western medieval Christianity, it's reinterpreted again as a 5-pointed star. And this is something that we can actually see actively in the literary culture of the day. For example, the late 14th century poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The poet digresses for a full 2 pages to tell us that when Gawain goes off on his quest to try and defeat this supernatural knight who can be beheaded and survive, he not only goes out wearing his physical armour, but also his spiritual armour as well. So he literally daubs himself everywhere that he can in representations of this 5-pointed star. The poet tells us that this has a Christian context, so that we find that the five-pointed star, one of the things it's representative of, for example, is the 5 wounds of Christ. So it's an entirely Christianized white magic, but there we see it right at the very heart of medieval culture, set down in this poem. And one of the things that Matthew Champion has discovered is this wonderful pentagram carved into the walls of St Mary's at Troston in Suffolk, which is directly carved over this demon. And we can see the demon here with the squab nose and the bulging eyes and the lolling tongue and the serrated teeth. And we can see that this pentagram has been carved over the top, and it looks very like it has been carved and recarved over time. So we've got this very Christianized symbol. It's also an endless line design. There was the poet of Gawain makes some comment about that as well. So these endless line designs become quite popular. It's not just the pentagram, but we're also seeing it in the form of mesh patterns, again from St Albans here. We're also seeing rather beautiful pelter designs, Solomonic seals, a couple of them from the Holy Trinity at Tattershall. We're also seeing gaming boards as well, such as Nine Men's Morris or Merrill's. Many of these actually are functional gaming boards, but in this instance, again from St Botolph's, this is a tiny, tiny, tiny illustration. It's also vertical on the walls, and it's almost impossible to actually use it as a gaming board. So again, it's this endless line design for in a sense, for trapping or pinning down the demon. Using this Christian white magic. And coming back to our compass drawn circle from Haresborough in Norfolk, here we can see an example of what is almost certainly again a ritual protection mark. Many of these, it should be said, are carved there by stonemasons or carpenters, because the compass drawn circle, such as this one here with the petals within it, does actually have an attribute where it can be used in geometry. And many buildings are set out using interlocking circles. However, it could also be that there is a symbiosis here, so that the building is kept safe because it is set out using this sacred magical geometry in and of itself. So some quite interesting debates to be had there. And again, something which is being debated currently in graffiti studies are these M's and V's, which have been traditionally interpreted as relating to the cult of the Virgin Mary, the M standing for Maria and the VV standing for the Virgo Virginum, the Virgin of Virgins. Now, as I say, this is something which is being actively debated at the moment, so it is still open to interpretation. But it is certainly something that may be there, and it may be imbued with a sense of asking for protection from the Virgin Mary. Again, Christian white magic. And all of this shouldn't be seen as particularly odd or kooky. It's there in formal church architecture in and of itself. So we can see Marian symbols such as the M symbol interlocked with the A and the R for Ave Maria Regina, Hail Mary Queen, from Blytheborough. We can see the VV there at Christchurch Priory, but also some of these symbols, such as the pentagram there at the heart of the tracery at Exeter Cathedral, and also those interlocking circles, the compass drawn designs at Norwich Cathedral as well. So it's there. It's something which people are copying. It's common parlance in medieval iconography. When we start thinking about where we find these ritual protection marks, that helps us to explain what these things are doing in and of themselves. In the later 16th century, the King of Scotland, James VI, later King James I of England, writes a book on how to deal with the problem of witches called the Demonology. And in this book, he explains to us that evil spirits enter buildings wherever the air flows, wherever there's a draft, that's where you've got the problem. And so if you start considering early modern housing, you can start to see that windows and doors are providing a route in. Yes, you can close them, but there's still going to be a draft. And of course, you can never close your chimney up. So these are the particular points where we might be expecting to see clusters of ritual protection marks. And that's even there in artwork of the period as well. So roughly contemporary with James's witch hunting book is this illustration from Germany. And we can see a crazy scene of a witch's sabbat there. We can see a witch trying to enter the building. She's holding a broomstick above her head, and she's trying to come down through the chimney. And of course, over the hearth there on the lintel, we can see ritual protection marks carved onto the timber, but crucially, they've been scored through to cancel out the white magic and enable the witch to come into the building. So there it is enshrined in the artwork of the period. A further type of graffiti that we do find in and around fireplaces, not exclusively, can be found almost anywhere within the buildings, within roofs, near doors, near windows, in fact on the stud-work of timber frame walls, are these burn marks as well. Now, this is probably my favourite type of graffiti. They are created using maybe a taper or a rushlight, in some instances maybe even a high status candle, and they leave this rather characteristic tear-shaped burn mark on the walls. And it used to be interpreted that these were the result of unattended lighting, which had unfortunately scored the building. Now, there's so many of these scorches in properties such as Gainsborough Old Hall, where there are literally thousands of them, that there must have been some very, very careless occupants and servants and workers and visitors to these buildings. And it's a surprise that we have any of these timber frame buildings surviving, quite frankly. Also, that when you look at them, there's never any, or there's rarely any evidence of how those lights, those putative lights, were even attached to the timbers. And there's been some really very good experimental archaeology done by John Dean and Nick Hill in this fantastic article which was put into the Vernacular Architecture Journal, where they showed that you cannot accidentally create one of these tear-shaped burn marks. The fact that if you leave an unattended light, it creates a rather amorphous blob. What it doesn't do is create this beautiful, beautiful shape, which can only be created deliberately by holding a candle at an angle in a single location for quite a long period of time. And we're talking 10, 20, 30 minutes in some instances, but there will come a point where the burn will cease, and you actually need to take a blade, a knife, or maybe a nail and scrape out the build-up of charring before applying the source of heat and light again. So this is a very, very deliberate activity, and it's somewhat reminiscent of those ship graffiti, where there's an element of time and mindfulness. And again, these could be seen as potentially prayers. They could also be interpreted as maybe part of a healing ritual, maybe purification of a building. They might just be latent Candlemas rituals from the Catholic year, and that there also might be, of course, this idea of protection or indeed inoculation of the building. If you burn it a little bit, you kill that piece of timber, you send it into a different plane of existence where it might be able to protect you from the things that go bump in the night. So there's lots of quite sophisticated elements of thinking in addressing these, which I don't think can ever purely come down to simply unattended lamps. A building that I worked on when I was working for the Museum of London Archaeology in 2015 that was absolutely littered with these burn marks was the Queen's House at the Tower of London. And this is not open to the public, but obviously the exterior is visible across Tower Green. It is a mid-16th century building constructed in 1539, 40, that kind of time. It's almost certainly the last building that Thomas Cromwell commissioned. It was one of the very last orders that he issued was the rebuilding of this place prior to his arrest and execution. It was later used as the house of the lieutenants of the Tower, the King and then later the Queen's representative at the Tower of London. So it's a very fine, very important, very significant building, and it's absolutely littered, particularly its roof structures, with historic graffiti of the ritual protection nature. So we find these very dense clusters of burn marks. Again, they're very close to windows and doors, so again they probably genuinely are ritual protection from spirit ingress here. And again, close to windows and doors, we find these scribed symbols. We see the VV there on the left hand side, and this compass drawn design on a common raft there. Something else seems to be going on in one of the areas of the Queen's house. We can see in the top left hand corner there a roof which has been ringed on the drawing there from the 17th century illustration of the Tower of London here. We can see the roof which has been ringed. This roof was remodelled in the 18th century. We can see it's got a gable end there, but it was actually given a hipped roof in the 18th century. And so they took off the end bay, carpenters took off the end bay, remodelled it to lay it down at an angle. And at that time, what seems to have happened is there was a real anxiety about the amount of air passing into the building, and was this bringing spirits within it? And there was a huge, dense distribution of burn marks around the remodelling works, and we can see all sorts of examples of that represented on the right-hand side there. But it's definitely a building that's had a fairly grim reputation. The Tower of London became a kind of a prison, a torture chamber during the 16th and 17th centuries. And this is a door on the left-hand side. This is the interior of a door, which has about 15 or 20 burn marks. It's quite difficult to count them in this case because they're all on top of one another around the framing of the interior. And if you look at the bottom two slides on the right hand side there, the open door is actually the chamber where Thomas More was incarcerated prior to his execution, and then adjacent to that, the closed door immediately next to the burn marks photograph is the door with all these burn marks around. That's the exterior of it. And again, this goes into an unlit chamber, which is conceivably a prison cell, and we might want to consider that these burn marks were put there potentially as prayers by the incarcerated, or possibly even purification after something maybe really quite unpleasant that occurred in there. And of course, as I said before, the Queen's house, and in fact the Tower of London, has this grim reputation by this point. Further upstairs in the building, we can see in the top right there, this is the council chamber where the Privy Council of England used to meet, and this is actually the space where Guy Fawkes was initially interrogated in 1605 after his capture at the Palace of Westminster. And that on the wall there, that big plaque, is actually a 1607 memorial to the gunpowder plot. So we can see that, yeah, this is a building which has had a turbulent history, and we can imagine that there might be many reasons why these burn marks may have been applied to the structure. So to conclude, and really just to give you a few pointers as to where you can find some more information, there's been some absolutely fantastic publications on the study of historic graffiti, and in particular ritual protection, over the last 5 or 6 years. Mentioned several times so far in this talk, Matthew Champion, Mr. Graffiti himself, and his book on medieval graffiti, available in all good bookshops and quite a few bad ones as well. It really has been an absolute sensation that's really opened the door to so many people getting involved in graffiti studies. And there have been many other books come out subsequently, such as only last year Brian Hoggard's book looking at magical house protection, which has an entire chapter looking at graffiti, but also looks at other ways in which people protected their houses from evil. And we also have lots of conferences. Now, whether or not these will occur due to, of course, coronavirus lockdown is perhaps uncertain, but there are a couple of conferences scheduled for the autumn. There's the Making Your Mark conference at York in October, and then Hidden Charms, which I religiously and irreligiously attend every single time it occurs. We've had it at Norwich and at Salisbury, and this year it's scheduled to happen in Chester, and fingers crossed I will be speaking at that as well. You may also be aware of the English Medieval Graffiti Facebook group, and you would be welcome to come and join us there as well. And I would like to finish on this slide. If graffiti changed anything, it would be illegal. Thank you very much for listening. My name's James Wright. I am a buildings archaeologist and heritage consultant at Triskelly Heritage, based in Nottingham in United Kingdom. If you would like to email me or tweet me with any questions after you've listened to this, you'll be more than welcome, and I promise to get back to you within a reasonable degree of time. Thank you very much.